47 miles north of Hearst, Ontario, where the boreal forest swallows the horizon and the nearest paved road is a memory that fades with every passing year, there sits a locomotive that was supposed to change everything. Its number was 6060. A Montreal Locomotive Works H-class, semi-streamlined 484, built in 1944 when the world was at war and Canada's railways were the arteries of a nation's survival. 115 feet of forged steel, rolled armor plate, and mechanical ambition weighing over 200 tons, designed to haul freight and passengers across a continent at speeds approaching 80 miles per hour, engineered with precision that would make modern manufacturers envious, built to last 40 years in regular service, perhaps 50 with proper maintenance. It lasted 6. Today, if you could reach it, and you can't, not easily, not without serious planning and equipment, you'd find 6060 stripped to its skeleton, half consumed by black spruce and muskeg, its massive driving wheels hub-deep in 40 years of accumulated leaf rot and permafrost. The streamlined casing that once gave it the appearance of speed and modernity, that once caught the light as it thundered past prairie towns and mining camps, has long since been scavenged by desperate locals or simply rusted through and collapsed. What remains is the brutal honesty of an industrial corpse, boiler tubes exposed like ribs after scavengers have finished their work, the firebox gaping open like a screaming mouth, valve gear frozen in positions that make no mechanical sense, as if the machine suffered a stroke mid-journey and simply stopped, every component locked in its final moment of operation. No one remembers exactly when the last person saw it running under its own power. Sometime in 1950, probably. Maybe early 1951 if the winter had been particularly harsh and repairs had been delayed. The records don't say. Canadian National Railways files from that period are incomplete, damaged by a warehouse fire in 1967, scattered across regional archives, or simply lost to bureaucratic indifference. But this much is documented, stamped in fading ink on water-stained paper. Locomotive 6060 was not retired with ceremony. It was not sold for scrap at market value. It was not donated to a museum or relegated to a siding to await restoration by enthusiasts. It was simply left, abandoned, forgotten as casually as you might forget an old coat in a closet. And the question that haunts every photograph, every faded maintenance log, every fragmentary crew report that surfaces in railway historical societies is this: how do you abandon something you cannot afford to lose? To understand why a machine worth more than most houses, worth more than some entire blocks of working-class homes in 1949, now sits rotting in the Canadian Shield, you have to understand what the Transcontinental Railways meant to Canada in the 1940s. Not symbolically, not as national mythology taught in schools, practically, economically, existentially. Canada in 1944 was a country held together by 2 ribbons of steel stretched across 3,000 miles of wilderness, rock and permafrost. The Canadian Pacific Railway in the south, completed in 1885 after a construction effort that killed thousands and bankrupted several fortunes. And the Canadian Northern, later absorbed into the Canadian National System, which threaded through the northern forests and granite outcroppings where settlement was sparse. Winter was a siege that lasted 7 months, and survival depended on supplies that could only arrive by rail. These weren't just transportation networks, they were civilization itself in regions where roads didn't exist and wouldn't exist for decades. They were the only year-round connection between the resource-rich wilderness and the industrial heartland. When the St. Lawrence froze solid, when dirt roads became impassable rivers of mud or buried under 10 feet of snow, when even horse-drawn wagons couldn't move, the trains still ran, or they were supposed to. The problem by the early 1940s was capacity. The war effort demanded unprecedented quantities of timber, nickel, copper, pulp, resources that northern Ontario had in abundance, resources critical to building planes and tanks and ships. But the locomotives hauling them were aging relics from the 1920s, undersized for the loads now required, and breaking down with alarming and costly frequency. Maintenance records from 1943, preserved in the Canadian National Railway archives in Montreal, paint a grim picture. On the Northern Ontario Division alone, over 30% of scheduled freight runs were delayed or cancelled due to locomotive failures. Not minor delays measured in minutes or hours, but catastrophic breakdowns that stranded entire trains in the wilderness for days. Mining operations in Timmins and Sudbury operated on knife-edge schedules, their entire production cycles dependent on coal deliveries and equipment shipments that arrived when they arrived. Sometimes. The delays cost money, thousands of dollars per incident, hundreds of thousands annually. And in wartime, they cost something more precious, production capacity that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. So Canadian National, under enormous pressure from both the federal government and private industry that threatened to build their own railways if CNR couldn't maintain service, ordered a new class of locomotives. Big ones, modern ones, revolutionary ones. The H-class 484s were built by Montreal Locomotive Works to a design that borrowed heavily from American superpower concepts, but adapted meticulously for Canadian conditions. Lower axle weights to accommodate the lighter rail common in northern routes. Streamlined casings, not just for aesthetics, though they were striking, to reduce wind resistance in the open prairie headwinds that could slow a train by 15 miles per hour. Roller bearings throughout the running gear to minimize friction and reduce maintenance. And crucially, boilers designed to burn lower-grade coal, the kind available in northern Ontario mining towns, without fouling tubes or losing dangerous amounts of steam pressure. On paper, examined by engineers in Toronto and Ottawa, they were perfect. In the foundry, in the assembly halls of Montreal, where Canadian industrial might reached its wartime peak, they were magnificent. Workers who helped build them, men who'd spent careers in heavy manufacturing, later recalled the precision with reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. Tolerances measured not in fractions of an inch, but in thousandths. Castings that arrived still radiating heat from the pour, metal so hot you could feel it from 20 feet away. Boiler shells constructed from rolled steel plate that took 3 men with pry bars just to maneuver into position for riveting. The riveting itself was an art form. Teams of 4 men, one heating rivets in a portable forge until they glowed cherry red, another catching them in a bucket and positioning them in pre-drilled holes, a third holding a bucking bar against the inner head, a fourth driving a pneumatic hammer that mushroomed the outer end. The noise was spectacular, the heat unbearable, the precision absolute. When the first H-class rolled out for testing in August 1944, engineers clocked it at 76 miles per hour on a straight stretch near Moncton, hauling 18 loaded freight cars weighing over 800 tons. The test crew reported that the locomotive pulled so smoothly they could balance a coin on the cab floor at full throttle. Locomotive 6060 was the 14th in the series, delivered to the Cochrane Yard in northern Ontario in November 1944, painted in CNR's distinctive dark green livery with gold numbering that caught the light. Its assignment was clear and critical. Freight service on the Transcontinental line between Cochrane and Nakina, a 200-mile stretch of track that cut through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Canada. Muskeg that could swallow a locomotive if the roadbed wasn't properly maintained. Granite outcroppings that required constant blasting to maintain clearances, river crossings where ice jams in spring could buckle rails and collapse bridges. The crews who drew 6060 for their runs initially considered themselves lucky. It was new, it was powerful, it had heat in the cab, a luxury after years of freezing in aging Mikados. Compared to the wheezing 282 locomotives they'd been nursing along, coaxing through every run with prayers and profanity, it felt like stepping from a mule cart into a Cadillac. That optimism lasted about 3 months. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came in February 1945, during a routine freight run that should have been unremarkable. Engineer Malcolm DeWitt, a 22-year veteran of the Northern Ontario runs who'd survived derailments, blizzards, and a boiler explosion that killed 2 men in 1938, reported to the Cochrane superintendent that 6060 had lost steam pressure twice during a single run from Hearst to Nakina. Not catastrophically. The locomotive hadn't stalled or required rescue. But the boiler, which should have maintained a steady 275 pounds per square inch under load, according to the manufacturer's specifications, kept dropping to 240, then 230, then recovering inexplicably. DeWitt had to throttle back, nurse the locomotive along like a sick animal, burn more coal than the run should have required to compensate for the mysterious pressure loss. The report was filed. A boiler inspector was dispatched from Cochrane, a man named Robert Hutchins, who'd inspected hundreds of locomotives over 2 decades. And he examined 6,060 in the Cochrane shop with the thoroughness of a surgeon. He checked every gauge, tested every valve, examined every accessible boiler tube for cracks or deposits, found nothing obviously wrong, no leaks, no blockages, no cracks in the casting. The boiler passed hydrostatic testing at 350 pounds per square inch, well above operating pressure. He signed off on it. 6,060 was returned to service with a clean bill of health. 2 weeks later, the same problem. DeWitt again, same route, same mysterious pressure drops. Then it happened to another crew, then another. By April, crews were actively refusing 6,660 if they had any choice in assignments, trading shifts, and calling in favors to avoid it. Not because it couldn't complete runs, it could barely if you knew its quirks and babied it along, but because the unpredictability wore them down psychologically. You'd have a perfect run to Nakina, smooth as silk, the boiler behaving exactly as designed. Then on the return trip, with the same coal from the same tender, under the same conditions, the steam pressure would collapse for no discernible reason. Or the injectors, the critical pumps that fed water into the boiler to replace what was converted to steam, would fail to prime, forcing the crew to stop, bleed the lines, clean the screens, restart, and hope. Hours lost, schedules shredded, cargo sitting in rail yards while customers screamed. Montreal Locomotive Works, facing pressure from CNR and worried about their reputation, sent a senior engineer north in May 1945. His name was Arthur Pemberton, a man with 2 engineering degrees and 15 years of locomotive design experience. His analysis, buried now in CNR archives in a file marked Confidential Engineering Assessment H-class Performance Issues, is brutally, devastatingly frank. The H-class locomotives, he concluded after 3 weeks of field observation and testing, had been designed for conditions that existed in textbooks and controlled laboratory tests, but not in the actual operating environment of Northern Ontario. The low-grade bituminous coal available in Cochrane and Hearst, with high ash content, unpredictable BTU output, and sulfur levels that varied wildly between shipments, was fouling the fireboxes faster than anyone had anticipated in Montreal's clean testing facilities. The streamlined casing, that beautiful Art Deco shroud intended to reduce drag and give the locomotive a modern appearance, was trapping heat in ways that caused thermal expansion in components that weren't designed for it. Boiler stays, the critical metal rods that held the boiler shell together against internal pressure, were loosening as they expanded and contracted. Rivets were weeping, allowing microscopic steam leaks that reduced pressure. And the roller bearings, which worked beautifully in the controlled conditions of test tracks and moderate climates, were failing in the abrasive grit and temperature extremes of actual Northern Ontario service. They'd freeze solid at 40 below, then overheat at 90 above. Pemberton's recommendation was clear and unequivocal: pull the entire H-class fleet from Northern Ontario and reassign them to prairie routes where coal quality was better, temperatures more moderate, and maintenance facilities more sophisticated. CNR management, meeting in a Montreal boardroom far from the frozen reality of Cochrane, rejected the recommendation. Too expensive, too disruptive, too politically complicated to explain to the mining companies and timber operations that depended on the service. The Northern Ontario Division desperately needed power, and the H-class locomotives, problems or not, quirks or not, were the most powerful units available. Making them work wasn't optional, it was essential. So 6060 stayed. And the crews, practical men who understood that complaining wouldn't change corporate decisions made in distant cities, adapted. They learned to read the locomotive's moods like farmers read weather, to anticipate the steam pressure drops by watching how the smoke left the stack, to carry spare injector parts wrapped in oiled cloth, to stop at specific locations where they'd cached tools and supplies. They developed workarounds that weren't in any manual, weren't approved by any engineer, but worked, adjusting dampers in specific patterns that seemed to stabilize combustion, using just enough throttle to avoid stressing the boiler stays, stopping every 60 miles, losing time but preventing catastrophic failures, to clear ash from the grates before it could build up and restrict airflow. For a while, maybe 18 months, it worked. Sort of. The locomotive ran, freight moved, timber reached the mills, copper and nickel reached the smelters. The war ended in triumph. Canada's industrial economy, bloated by wartime production, began its inevitable transition to peacetime manufacturing. And in that transition, in that shift from the guaranteed government contracts of wartime to the competitive chaos of peacetime markets, the fundamental economics of rail transport began to shift beneath CNR's feet like muskeg in spring. By 1948, Canadian National Railway was bleeding money, not just on the Northern Ontario division, that was expected, those routes had never been profitable, but system-wide. The war had deferred maintenance on thousands of miles of track, rolling stock was worn out beyond any reasonable repair, bridges needed replacing, stations needed rebuilding, and now, with highways expanding under new government infrastructure programs and trucking companies offering faster, more flexible freight service without the constraints of fixed routes and schedules, the railways were losing customers they'd taken for granted for decades. Pulp and paper mills that had depended on rail for decades were signing contracts with trucking firms that promised door-to-door delivery. Mining operations were building their own roads to connect directly to processing centers, eliminating the railway as middleman. The economics that had made the transcontinental railways inevitable were eroding. The cost of keeping a locomotive like 6060 in service became impossible to justify to accountants examining spreadsheets in Toronto. Maintenance records from 1949, meticulously kept by shop supervisors who knew their jobs depended on documentation, show repair costs averaging $1,400 per month. $1,400 every single month, just to keep it operational. That was nearly the price of a new automobile every month for one locomotive, and that didn't include fuel costs, crew salaries, or the cascading economic damage of delays when it broke down mid-run and stranded cargo. In August 1949, CNR's Board of Directors made the decision to consolidate operations. It was presented as strategic restructuring. In reality, it was managed collapse. The Northern Ontario division would reduce service, routes would be restructured, meaning abandoned, unprofitable lines would be discontinued, and locomotives that couldn't prove their value in hard numbers would be retired immediately. 6060 was near the top of the list. Its maintenance costs were documented, its reliability issues were documented, its strategic value in a peacetime economy with growing truck competition was questionable at best. The plan was straightforward: send 6060 to the scrapyard in Montreal, disassemble it systematically, the steel recycled for new construction, the brass fittings sold to marine suppliers, the copper wiring stripped and melted down, the boiler cut up for salvage, the entire machine reduced to its constituent materials and redistributed into the economy. It was supposed to be routine. Locomotives were scrapped all the time. There was an established process: documentation, transportation, valuation. It never made it. The records, such as they exist, incomplete and contradictory, indicate that 6060 was moved from Cochrane to a temporary storage siding at Ober, a tiny railyard consisting of 3 sidings and a water tower about 90 miles north, in October 1949. The plan was to gather several condemned locomotives there, then move them south to Montreal in a single consist to save on towing costs, economy of scale, efficiency, but the move south never happened. CNR's financial crisis deepened through 1950. Management changed, priorities shifted, the salvage program was postponed again, then quietly forgotten as more urgent problems demanded attention. And somewhere in the chaos of consolidation, downsizing, layoffs, and bureaucratic reshuffling that consumed CNR in the early 1950s, locomotive 6060 was simply lost in the paperwork. Not immediately, not dramatically. Crew reports from 1950 mention it still sitting at Ober, accumulating snow. In 1951, a track inspector doing his rounds noted that it had been vandalized, Somebody had pried off the brass builder's plate, probably sold it for scrap value. By 1952, it wasn't mentioned in any report at all. When CNR finally remembered to send a salvage crew to Ober in 1957, 8 years after 6060 had been parked there, they found it so deteriorated that the cost of moving it exceeded its scrap value. The economic equation had inverted. The copper wiring had been stripped by vandals or desperately poor locals who needed money more than they cared about trespassing laws. The bell was gone, sold to some collector, or melted down. Even some of the driving wheel tires, the steel rims that protected the wheel faces, had been removed, probably by local farmers who repurposed the steel for sled runners or equipment repairs. The salvage foreman, a practical man named Thomas Brennan, who'd spent 20 years evaluating scrap value, did the math. Moving 6060 would require heavy equipment, a crane capable of lifting 200 tons, transport trucks, dismantling tools, at least a dozen men working for weeks. And for what? Steel that had been exposed to the elements for 8 years, weakened by rust and thermal stress. Brass and copper already stripped. Boiler tubes likely cracked from freeze-thaw cycles. The decision was made to leave it, file the paperwork, write it off as a total loss, move on. 7 years later, nature made that decision permanent. In the spring of 1964, heavy flooding from rapid snowmelt and unseasonable rain undermined the siding where 6060 sat. The ground beneath it, northern muskeg, that deceptive mixture of peat, permafrost and ice that looks solid but isn't, liquefied. The locomotive, which weighed over 200 tons, didn't collapse dramatically. It didn't tip over or slide. It just sank, an inch at a time over the course of several days, settling into the softening earth like a massive animal lying down to die, until the driving wheels, those precisely engineered discs of forged steel, were partially submerged in cold, acidic, oxygen-poor mud that would preserve them even as it consumed them. By the time the flooding receded in late May, 6060 was unmovable by any practical means. To extract it would require excavators to dig down through waterlogged peat, cranes to lift components in sections, probably cutting the boiler apart with torches just to make it manageable. All this equipment would need to be transported over roads that didn't exist to a location so remote that the logistics alone would cost more than a dozen new diesel-electric locomotives, which by 1964 were rapidly replacing steam across the entire CNR system. So it stayed, and it sank deeper each year as the permafrost beneath it thawed and refroze in seasonal cycles. And the forest, utterly indifferent to industrial ambitions or financial calculations or human nostalgia, began its patient work of reclamation. Black spruce seedlings found purchase in the wind-blown soil that accumulated on the boiler top. Moss colonized every horizontal surface. Birch saplings sprouted between the wheel spokes. Rust, that slow oxidation that converts forged steel back into iron oxide, spread like cancer through every component. Today, reaching locomotive 6060 requires planning, equipment, and determination that borders on obsession. You need a float plane willing to land on one of the small lakes north of Ober, lakes with names like Strikeback and Hamel that appear on few maps. Then a 5-mile hike through terrain that alternates unpredictably between granite outcroppings and muskeg bog, where a single wrong step can plunge you thigh-deep in cold, acidic water. There are no trails, no markers, no cell phone coverage, just compass bearings and GPS coordinates shared quietly among the small community of railway historians and industrial archaeology enthusiasts who make this pilgrimage. The few people who have made the trek in recent years, perhaps 30 or 40 individuals total, mostly railway historians with academic credentials or particularly obsessive photographers documenting industrial decay, describe a scene that's almost surreal in its quiet devastation. The locomotive sits at a slight angle, bow down, as if perpetually braking against a grade that no longer exists. Black spruce has grown through the cab windows, their trunks now thick as a man's arm, roots spreading inside the cab like fingers exploring. The smokestack, once tall enough to clear overhead wires and telegraph lines, is now just a ragged stump, its top sheared off by ice accumulation or wind, or the simple mechanical stress of metal weakened by decades of thermal cycling. The boiler shell, once gleaming beneath the streamlined casing, protected by paint and pride, is now pitted and flaking, eaten away by sun, wind, rain, snow, and decades of freeze-thaw cycles that expand water in every microscopic crack and crevice, wedging the metal apart, molecule by molecule. But here's what strikes visitors most, what appears in every account, every photograph, every description: how small it seems. This machine, which once represented the absolute pinnacle of steam locomotive engineering, which required teams of skilled workers to maintain and experienced engineers to operate, which was supposed to bind a nation together and make prosperity inevitable, it's being consumed by trees and moss and time, and nature is winning effortlessly. The driving wheels, those massive forged steel discs designed to transfer thousands of horsepower to the rails, designed to withstand forces that would destroy lesser metals, are now half buried in soil and decomposing vegetation. Birch saplings grow between the spokes like prison bars. The valve gear, that intricate mechanical ballet of rods and eccentrics and links that converted linear piston motion into rotary wheel motion, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, is frozen solid in rust, its precision lost to oxidation, its purpose forgotten. And yet, impossibly, the locomotive is still recognizable. If you know what you're looking at, if you've studied the Montreal Locomotive Works technical diagrams, if you've seen photographs of 6060 in its brief operational prime, gleaming and proud, you can trace the lines of its original design beneath the decay. The subtle curve of the streamlined casing, still visible where rust hasn't completely consumed it. The placement of the sand dome, that critical reservoir of dry sand used to improve traction on slippery rails. The way the boiler tapers toward the smokebox, an engineering decision based on thermodynamic efficiency. It's a ghost, but a specific ghost, not just any abandoned locomotive. This one, number 6060, built with precision by men whose names are lost, operated with hope by crews who believed in the promise of technology, abandoned by necessity when economics overruled engineering, consumed by nature that neither knows nor cares about human ambitions. So why does this matter? Why should we care about a locomotive that failed, that sits in a place most people will never visit, on a railway line that doesn't even exist anymore, serving a purpose that was made obsolete by trucks and highways and the simple march of technological progress? Because 6060 isn't just a machine, it's a record, a physical archive of the gap between what we plan and what actually happens, between engineering elegance and operational reality, between the promises we make to ourselves about progress and the compromises we're forced to accept when reality imposes its terms. The Transcontinental Railways were supposed to make Canada inevitable, a nation from sea to sea, bound by steel, prosperous and unified. They didn't. They made it possible, which isn't the same thing. Possibility requires constant work, constant maintenance, constant investment. Inevitability suggests a natural conclusion. The railways proved that nothing about nationhood is natural or inevitable. The H-class locomotives were supposed to solve CNR's capacity crisis. They didn't. They revealed how fragile our solutions are when confronted with conditions we didn't adequately predict, how quickly the elegant can become the obsolete, and locomotive 6060, rusting in the forest north of Ober, is the monument to that revelation. Not built as a monument, not intended as one. No architect designed it to represent the limits of human ambition. No committee chose its location for symbolic value. But it serves that purpose nonetheless, more honestly than any intentional memorial ever could. There are no plaques, no interpretive signs explaining its significance, no park rangers giving tours, no guided walks with historical context. Just the slow, patient, inexorable work of entropy, reducing forged steel back to iron oxide, one molecule at a time, at a pace that makes human lifespans seem like heartbeats. The forest doesn't memorialize the locomotive, it processes it, recycles it, uses it as a substrate for new growth. The iron in those driving wheels will eventually become iron in the soil, which will feed the trees, which will shelter the wolves and caribou and bears. The carbon in that boiler will return to the atmosphere, be absorbed by spruce and lichen, cycle through the ecosystem that was there long before the railway arrived and will be there long after the last trace of 6060 dissolves. In 1,000 years, no one will know there was ever a locomotive in that spot. The forest will have digested it completely, incorporated its atoms into new life, erased every trace of human engineering. The clearing will close, the soil will level. Future archaeologists, if they exist, will find nothing, no foundation, no artifact, no clue that 200 tons of precisely engineered steel ever rested there. But right now, in this narrow window between existence and erasure, in this moment that will seem impossibly brief when viewed from the perspective of geological time, it's still there. Still visible to those who make the effort. Still telling its story to anyone willing to make the trek and listen. What lessons do we take from abandoned machines? That progress isn't linear, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that sometimes our grandest projects end not with ceremonies or celebrations, but with silence and rust and the slow patience of trees reclaiming what we borrowed. The question isn't whether we'll forget stories like this. We will. Memory is selective. History is curated. We remember what we choose to remember, what serves our narratives, what makes us feel good about our trajectory. The failures, the abandonments, the quiet surrenders to entropy, these fade first. The question is, what else are we forgetting right now? What other machines, structures, promises, sitting in other forests, other deserts, other corners of the landscape, are quietly dissolving while we're not looking? What other locomotives are sinking into other bogs, their stories untold, their lessons unlearned? Maybe 6060 has company. Maybe there are hundreds of these stories, thousands, scattered across the continent. Locomotives and bridges and entire towns, built with confidence, operated with hope, abandoned with resignation, reclaimed with the indifference of nature that recognizes no difference between a forged steel locomotive and a fallen tree. Or maybe every abandoned thing is unique in its abandonment. Maybe every rust pattern tells a different story. Maybe every tree growing through a broken window marks a specific failure, a specific moment when economics overruled engineering, when nature overruled economics, when entropy won its inevitable victory. What do you think? When you build something to last, knowing deep down that nothing lasts, does that change how you build it? Does it change the precision you demand, the care you invest, the pride you take in craftsmanship? Or just how you remember it when it's gone? How you tell its story to those who come after, who never saw it gleaming and new, who only know the rust and the silence and the trees? Maybe that's the real question Locomotive 6060 asks from its clearing in the forest. Not whether we can build things that last, but whether we have the courage to remember things that didn't.